The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Members of the full committee who are not members of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance may participate in today's hearing. All members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is entitled Financial Intelligence and Enforcement, Treasury's Role in Safeguarding the American Financial System. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Today's hearing will examine Treasury's vital role in safeguarding the financial system. Since its founding in 2004, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence has been instrumental in detecting terrorist financing, money laundering, drug cartel activity, and other illicit movements in our financial system. The Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence comprises several bureaus, including the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crime, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and the Treasury Executive Office for Asset Forfeiture. Collectively, these units are tasked with the collection of financial intelligence, enforcement of the Bank Secrecy Act, administering economic and trade sanctions, policy development, and receipt of non-tax forfeitures. Recently, both Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and Undersecretary Mandler have dedicated to improving the effort to stop terrorist finance. In that vein, Treasury announced in May that the United States and Saudi Arabia would establish and co-chair the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center. This is a collaborative effort to confront new and evolving threats from terrorist financing. As we acknowledge the fluid environment of illicit finance, cooperation between policymakers, law enforcement, intelligence agency, and financial institutions is necessary to detect, identify, and disrupt the funding of criminals and their operations. It is estimated that criminals in the United States alone generate some $300 billion in illicit proceeds that might involve money laundering, while globally, the volume of money laundering could be as much as $1.6 trillion annually. I'm encouraged to hear the Treasury is reviewing the Bank Secrecy Act and wants to work with Congress as we contemplate ways to modernize the BSA that will increase its effectiveness, strengthen the safety of the financial system, and reduce burdens on financial institutions. In today's hearing, I hope to discuss how we are currently combating terrorism and illicit finance, including what tools, partnerships are working well in the effort to detect and disrupt criminal actors. Would also appreciate any comments about deficiencies in our system that may impede our fight against terrorist and criminal finance and what can be done to strengthen Treasury's capabilities. Would like to thank our witness, the Honorable Sigal Mandler, for being here today, and I look forward to her expert testimony on these very important issues. Now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Undersecretary Mandler, for being here today to discuss this topic. One of the most effective tools we have to combat both international and domestic threats is to cut off the funding of bad actors. And Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence is at the heart of that mission. From administering sanctions on North Korea, Russia, Iran, and other adversaries, to combating terrorist financing and stopping money laundering, TFI has its hands full. Additionally, we face an increasingly sophisticated global financial system. The rise of cryptocurrencies, increased cyber threats, and reduced transparency from shell companies has added an additional layer of complexity to TFI's mission. As financial technology and practices have changed, our policies and security also must adapt to strengthen our financial system and keep America safe. Specifically, I look forward to discussing anti-money laundering modernization, improving threat detection, and making the true ownership of shell companies transparent to law enforcement officials. And as the chairman said, this committee is looking at ways to make sure that our secrecy laws, our know your customer laws are effective for those in the Treasury Department as well as law enforcement. We want to make sure that we have a safe and secure country, and finance is at the heart of that, all the while protecting the privacy of our citizens. So it's a big chore that you have Madam Secretary, and we look forward to hearing your testimony today.
Today, we welcome the testimony of Sigal Mandalkar. Would recognize the gentleman, Mr. Pittenger, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for calling this this hearing. Also, thank you, Undersecretary Sigal Mandalkar, for joining us today. And as well, would like to thank you for your participation in December at the Parliamentary Intelligence Security Forum. It'll be very important. We have about 100 delegates from 43 countries to date. And also appreciate you sending a staff member down to Buenos Aires for the forum there in November. Madam Secretary, I want to speak with you about concerns that I have referencing the classified memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Qatar on terror financing that I reviewed recently at the State Department. While this document is classified, at this point it is unclear to me. We're having a difficult time in the state making the MOU available for members to review at a convenient time at the SCIF on Capitol Hill. There appears to be nothing sensitive that I've read in it that would justify highly classified information, but there's very little there in terms of specifics, but it did strike me as limited in a number of key ways. As you know, it's the specifics that we are concerned about in Congress as we look to establish our own congressional oversight. When we look at the comments made as well by Secretary Tillerson in July when he signed the MOU, and Secretary Mnuchin's comments about the MOU just a few days ago, there appears to be a number of references about the agreement, but again, very few specifics. Here are some specifics that we do know. We know that Qatar has supported Hamas. We know Qatar has harbored actors that finance terrorists, like Saeed al-Kabi, who in 2015 was designated by the U.S. Treasury as a financial supporter of al-Qaeda and al-Nusra Front. We know Qatar finances the Muslim Brotherhood around the Middle East and has replaced Saudi Arabia as the chief financier of radical Islamic teachings. Qatar has housed leaders from Hamas, such as Khalid Mashal. They've also housed prominent members of the Muslim Brotherhood, like Sheikh al-Qadari, and as well the Taliban. We know that Qatar has allowed its country to be a safe haven for known terrorists. We know Qatar has helped finance terrorists by paying ransom for kidnappings. Qatar has as well supported al-Qaeda in Syria, a comment that the Emir made to me directly. During this question time, we'll explore this further. However, I do realize that one of the best avenues of defeating our enemies is putting a stop to the flow of money that's used to fund the terrorism. The Treasury Department's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence is on the front lines of the war on terror, and I commend you for your work to ensure that terrorist enterprises cannot reap the benefits of normal banking operations and other manners that are essential for them to perform. Congress must as well provide the necessary support for these efforts. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's important hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to welcome Undersecretary Mandalkar. Today's hearing provides an opportunity to examine not only the roles and responsibilities of the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which administers targeted financial sanctions and has a critical mandate for disrupting illicit finance, but also to discuss your priorities as the office's newly confirmed Undersecretary. At a July hearing where Secretary Mnuchin testified, I tried to get clarity on a letter that I'd sent to him on the actions the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network takes upon receipt of information that indicates potential criminal activity and the procedures in place to analyze and disseminate such information to the appropriate law enforcement authorities. He was not forthcoming. So given your role in overseeing FinCEN's activities, I'm hoping you can shed light on whether proactively notifying law enforcement about potential violations of law is a priority for you, including, and in particular, when such violations may relate to the president, members of his immediate family, his cabinet, and Russian oligarchs subject to U.S. sanctions. Given the latest revelations about Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross's business entanglements with sanctioned Russian persons, I do hope you are paying serious attention to this matter. I would also briefly like to touch on anti-money laundering reform and the importance of closing a number of gapping loopholes that I'm hopeful this committee can address legislatively and that you would also support. In particular, I hope that we can apply minimum anti-money laundering requirements to persons involved in real estate settlements and closing. Number two, require beneficial ownership disclosures for anonymous shell companies. Number three, help mitigate wholesale de-risking and its adverse consequences, particularly for vulnerable populations. With that, I look forward to your testimony, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of Sigal Mandelker. Sigal is the Undersecretary of the Treasury Department's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. She has held this critically important position for just about 4 months after receiving Senate confirmation on June 21st. Ms. Mandelker was previously a partner at Proskauer Rose LLP in New York. She also served in senior law enforcement and national security positions at the Department of Justice and Homeland Security. As Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division of DOJ, Sigal oversaw 4 major sections and a number of significant cross-border prosecutions. Prior to that position, she served as counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security. She also previously worked on counterterrorism and national security issues as counsel to the Deputy Attorney General. Sigal also served as an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. She was a law clerk to the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and to the Honorable Edith H. Jones, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Sigal received her law degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and her bachelor's from the University of Michigan. Ms. Mandelker, you'll now be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce, Vice Chairman Pittenger, Ranking Member Perlmutter, and distinguished members of the committee. As the Undersecretary for Terrorism's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, I'm honored to appear before you in my first appearance formally before this committee today to discuss the tremendous work that TFI is doing to safeguard the U.S. and international financial systems. The offices I lead are tasked with using financial intelligence, expertise, and our unique authorities to combat terrorist financing, money laundering, weapons proliferators, rogue regimes, human rights abusers, and other national security threats to the United States and our allies. We work around the clock to deny illicit actors access to the U.S. and international financial systems, disrupt their revenue streams, and degrade their capabilities. Since the early days of TFI, when Congress and the executive branch had the tremendous vision to put OFAC, FinCEN, OIA, and TFFC under one roof, our role in protecting our national security has grown dramatically. TFI's economic authorities have become one of this administration's top non-kinetic tools of choice. In the 4 months since I was confirmed, we have been deploying our economic authorities at a rapid pace to address some of our greatest national security threats. In addition to cutting off funding for terrorist groups, our authorities and actions proactively implement U.S. policy towards Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, human rights, and in many other areas. In order to be even more effective in meeting these threats, we are ensuring that our components are properly integrated, working closely together and deploying the tools and authorities best suited to each challenge. As part of this approach, we're conducting intelligence-driven action using TFI's tools in a complementary, strategic fashion, assessing the outcomes of actions and adjusting our strategy for maximum impact, while collaborating and engaging with our partners in the interagency and, of course, working closely with the Congress. TFI has adopted this integrated approach, most notably in countering one of our highest priority threats, North Korea. Our strategy is focused on attacking North Korea's key financial vulnerabilities. All components of my office are working in concert towards this objective. Underpinning these efforts is our ability to rely on intelligence, and so Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis provides expert analysis of North Korea's financial networks, identifying key nodes to target for disruptive action. OFAC investigates and targets individuals and entities that support North Korea's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs. This year, OFAC designated well over 70 individuals and entities related to North Korea as part of our concerted effort to pressure the regime. Just last week, FinCEN finalized the USA Patriot Act Section 311 designation of Bank of Dandong, a Chinese bank facilitating North Korean money laundering and sanctions evasion, and FinCEN also issued an advisory to financial institutions regarding North Korea's attempts to use front companies to launder money and evade sanctions. The Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes leads our international engagement efforts to work with partner countries, thereby hardening the defenses worldwide and depriving North Korea of alternative financial avenues. The private sector also plays an essential role in identifying and disrupting illicit North Korean financial activity, and the information provided by financial institutions has been critical to our efforts to map out and disrupt the illicit financial networks upon which North Korea relies. By integrating our authorities across the components, we are seeing real impact. As just one example, on August 22nd, we designated 3 Chinese coal companies collectively responsible for importing nearly $500 million worth of North Korean coal between 2013 and 16. Likewise, our 311 determination, advisories, and outreach and guidance have put the world on notice of the risks of doing business with North Korea. We have employed this integrated approach to address other pressing national security threats as well, including in our efforts to counter Iran's malign behavior and the IRGC's continued support for terrorism, as well as Nicolas Maduro's assault on democracy and human rights in Venezuela. I want to recognize the tremendous career professionals of TFI who work tirelessly to protect our national security and our financial system. The TFI team, both here in the United States and overseas, is constantly striving to protect the United States and its allies and partners. I'm pleased also to announce today that we are adding a valuable new member of our team, the new director of FinCEN, Ken Blanco. Ken is joining us from the Department of Justice, where he has been serving as the acting Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. I also want to emphasize the importance we place on working with all of you in Congress to combat the threats our nation faces, as well as ensuring the continued success of TFI. I look forward to working with this committee and other members of Congress as we seek to fulfill our shared responsibility to keep Americans safe and secure. And I look forward to your questions.
Thanks again for being here today, and thank you for that statement. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. So last May, FinCEN finalized regulations on the CDD, the customer due diligence, and then there were later statements that listed that there might be high-risk clients that require collection of beneficial ownership information. Have you got anything more on the high-risk clients and how they would be recognized or identified?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. We are and continue to be working on additional guidance that we can provide to financial institutions. We recognize that there continue to be questions about implementation of the CDD rule, and I anticipate that we'll be able to issue those in short order.
Okay. The Terrorist Financing Target Center that the President helped Saudi Arabia cut the ribbon on earlier this year, members of the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, all of us joining together to fight terrorists. That's a significant, I think, undertaking for the entire world. Do you have any of the plans on that? Can you talk a little bit more about what's actually happening there and what it means to the rest of the world?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Secretary Mnuchin and I were actually in the region 2 weeks ago, where we were there for a different ribbon cutting, which was of the actual facility where the TFTC is going to be housed in Riyadh. We not only visited Saudi Arabia, we also went to other countries in the region, and a big focus of our trip was really on talking about what our next plans are for the TFTC. We believe that this could be, and it should be, a truly historic development in our efforts to counter terrorist financing. And as part of that historic development, we were very pleased for the first time ever to have issued joint designations with each of the countries in the GCC during our trip against ISIS and AP members who are facilitating financing of terrorism in Yemen. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. We're going to be focused, among other areas, on information sharing with our key partners, on issuing additional joint designations and actions, and we also have a lot of work to do in the region on capacity building, which I think is frankly very welcome from our partner countries. So we're going to be doing the work that we need to do to elevate their domestic designation regimes, and again to use this as a historic, groundbreaking effort in our fight against terrorist financing.
So I guess that it's fair to say that we are developing significant new directions for partners and friends in that region, relationships that might be somewhat delicate, relationships that need to be built over a period of time. Is that an accurate assessment that we're finding cooperation from countries that maybe before were sitting on the sidelines, especially regarding ISIS and financial terrorist financing?
Absolutely. We're seeing a real commitment to working in partnership with us in connection, not only with the center, but also on our bilateral relationships there. I've had a number of meetings in the last 4 months with my counterparts here in the United States in the region, and then when we were in the region, we enhanced those relationships and discussed the details of what our expectations are going to be to make this truly a successful effort.
And my personal opinion has always been that we will win the fight against radical Islam when the moderate Arab nations begin to buy in and when they begin to take the lead. We'll be there as a support mechanism, but when we can take leadership from them, it's going to be far more effective for the world. It will be far more effective for that region. So please keep us advised of any ways that we can help and cooperate in that. Now, one of the things we've had tremendous number of briefings and just sit-down meetings with members of the subcommittee, and one of the things that is really coming to light is that tremendous capabilities exist in the form of data analytics. Do you all see your agencies working more in that regard, and are you going to use off-the-shelf things or try to create it internally?
We already have internal data analytic capabilities, which have been very useful. We're also exploring other ways in which we can work in the fintech, regtech space to enhance our capabilities. Look, we need to stay on top of the technology. We need to be leaders in the technology, and that's something that we're very committed to doing.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it Mandelker? How do you say it?
Perfect, yes.
Okay. A couple questions. So you ticked off a list of countries against which we have sanctions: North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. Let's talk about Russia for just a second. You kind of laid out some of the successes we see in interdiction and other things against North Korea. We're really trying to constrain and the money going there. How have our sanctions worked from your point of view against Russia? And if you could name a couple of successes and places where you think there are some problems.
So we've been very steady in our sanctions efforts against Russia. As you may know, in June, we designated an entire tranche of entities and individuals in connection with Russia. We've also been working steadily to implement the requirements of CAATSA, the bill that you passed in August, and we've been issuing significant guidance which has continued to to enforce and tighten our sanction regimes against Russia. Look, this is going to be an effort that we're going to have to stay steady in implementing and in enforcing, and it's one that we're very much committed to doing.
Okay. You brought up Saudi Arabia, and there have been a lot of changes in Saudi Arabia in the last 2 weeks. Maybe since you were in Saudi Arabia, or maybe when you were there. Obviously, some efforts to root out corruption among some of their leadership and the ruling family. In the structure that you're putting together in Saudi Arabia, has this had any effect on you so far in the last couple of weeks? Have you seen it?
No, we haven't seen any changes in that regard. We have partners that we work with who are very much in place in Saudi Arabia, and we'll continue to work closely with them.
You talked about you've got a new director in place over at TFI. Obviously, we all think that the task you have ahead of you in both monitoring, enforcing sanctions, watching for illegal activity, financial activity, it's a big task and it's an important task. But what I'm concerned about, over time, in fiscal year 2017, the office had 421 employees with a budget of $123 million. However, under the current budget proposal from the president, you reduce that to 386 with a budget that is dropped by about $10 million. How are you going to do your work?
Well, Congressman, I think actually that's what happened in the budget was that the president's budget kept the numbers consistent with the with the Obama administration's budget. The Congress then provided us with additional resources in the FY17 omnibus budget. And of course, we've also been vocal in asking for additional resources to help us fund the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center. So what I'm focused on doing is making sure that we are maximizing the resources that we have, that we're deploying all of our authorities in an aggressive and integrated way, and we've been doing so at a very rapid pace.
Okay. Last question. The chairman brought up data analytics. I mean, one of the things that all of us are facing, but certainly TFI and FinCEN, is this development of new types of currencies. And so cryptocurrencies and cyber sort of warfare and cyber attacks. What is it, how does TFI view these new currencies? What is it that you're doing to try to understand them?
So we're actually doing a lot in the virtual currency space. As you may know, a month or two ago, we issued an enforcement action against a virtual currency scheme that was being used by illicit actors overseas. And we had, in connection with that enforcement action, we levied over $100 million fine. We're also the leaders really in the world on regulating virtual currency. We do think that it's very concerning that these kinds of cryptocurrencies can be used for illicit activity. It's something I'm actually very familiar with from my time at the Justice Department, where I supervised the prosecution of I think it was one of the first of these kinds of entities. It was called eGold. And so we have to stay very vigilant in this regard. We have to be ahead of the technology. We have to watch the use of these cryptocurrencies by illicit actors, and we're very committed to doing so. We're also urging other countries to take on this problem. We're only going to be successful if we have regulatory regimes really all over the world that ensure that the right AML efforts are put towards preventing illicit actors from abusing these kinds of currencies.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for your great work. To the issue of your budgeting, I think we get enormous bang for the buck for what you do, and I really commend you, and you're the right person doing the right job. As it relates to the MOU and to Qatar, I think our interest is really in oversight as Ronald Reagan would say, trust but verify. How will we be able to assure that we've been able to cut off support, for example, to government-sponsored or government-affiliated, government-sanctioned support for, let's say, Hamas and other terrorist groups in the region?
Let me just start by saying thank you for the compliment, but really I have an army of people in back of me who are doing tremendous work around the clock in TFI. So
we're led well.
Yes, well, thank you. So in terms of Qatar, which I know is a specific area of concern for you, we have been working in my short time in TFI, but really historically with Qatar on this terrorist financing problem, just as we've worked with all countries in that region. It's been a big area of focus for us. And so I know you mentioned of the MOU. We have a number of lines of efforts under the MOU.
I think I'd be interested to know kind of the benchmarks that we have there, the metrics, what the timetable would be in terms of their performance, and if they're doing what we've asked them to do. How will Congress know that? So
I'd be happy to come in and give you a briefing on our efforts with respect to Qatar. What I can tell you is that this has to be a long-term relationship. So we've gotten a lot of, I think we've made some progress with Qatar. Secretary Mnuchin mentioned it recently. We're working on a number of lines of effort with them, and we're seeing a lot of willingness on their part to work closely in connection with us on terrorist financing in various different ways. But this has to be a concerted and long-term effort, as it does with every country, frankly, in the region.
Yes, ma'am. I'd had the ambassador in this morning, which we have already met several times, and I think he understands the issues and our concerns. We had a very amenable discussion. I think we want to find out, what are the repercussions if Qatar continues to support Hamas, or if they don't enforce their laws, they're in country, they don't prosecute. We'd like to see what's our response going to be to enforce this to occur.
Again, we have a productive relationship right now with the Qataris, where we're working with them on a number of different lines of effort, including capacity building, which we do with other countries in the region, and in information sharing. And of course, we were pleased that they joined us in the designations of a couple of weeks ago against ISIS and AQAP. But it's something that we have to continue to monitor very, very closely and carefully. We actually have an attaché in Qatar who works closely with our counterparts, and I personally do so as well.
Thank you. Last month, the Treasury Department took action to sanction Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a supporter of terrorism. Do you intend to take additional actions to designate individual IRGC-owned companies or front entities or individuals affiliated with the Guard?
Well, since the beginning of this administration, we have targeted over 70 entities and individuals connected to the IRGC's support for terrorism, their ballistic missile program, their human rights violations, among other areas. As you know, this is a very high area of concern for us, and as you recognize, we just designated the IRGC under our Executive Order 13224. So while I can't tell you what additional actions we're going to take in the coming months, rest assured that the Treasury Department is very focused on implementing the President's strategy to target the malign behavior that Iran has been engaging in.
And very quickly, Mr. Chairman, I do have some additional questions, if I could submit them to the record for the Madam Secretary to respond to. Just quickly, are there additional steps that you would recommend that the U.S. take to target IRGC's role in the Iranian economy?
Well, we are taking a number of steps to target the IRGC. We've also been very vocal in terms of the strategies that we are going to be employing, and again, you will certainly be hearing more from us on that front.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. FinCEN's most recent geographic targeting order, the GTO, is designed to combat money laundering within the real estate sector. It requires U.S. title insurance companies to identify the natural persons behind shell companies used to pay for high-end residential real estate in 7 U.S. real estate markets, and it now captures a broader range of transactions, including both cash and wire transactions. Is that right?
That's correct.
Separately, I'm concerned because, let me just give you this case. It has been alleged in Paul Manafort's recent federal criminal indictment that he purchased 2 New York City residential real estate properties using 2 LLCs registered in New York. Specifically, it has been alleged that Manafort paid $2,850,000 for the Soho property and $3 million in cash for the Brooklyn property, and all money used to purchase the properties came from companies in Cyprus that Manafort owned or controlled. Now, if this kind of activity occurred when the current GTO was in place, would this type of activity have to be reported to FinCEN? And what happens when FinCEN receives reports like this? Are they flagged and passed along to law enforcement?
So, Congressman, I don't want to comment on any particular investigation. That, of course, is being handled by the special prosecutor. But I can tell you, as a general matter, when we issue our GTOs, and real estate has been a focus for us, as you know, and we recently expanded it thanks to the authorities that were provided to us by the Congress to wire transactions. That is something that we receive and, of course, work closely with our law enforcement partners. There are various ways in which we get information from the private sector, and law enforcement, of course, has access to the information that we receive.
AML experts, community banks, large financial institutions, and members of the law enforcement community widely agree that we need to close loopholes that allow anonymous shell companies to mask the identities of illicit actors. In recent weeks, we've seen Paul Manafort, President Trump's former campaign manager, be indicted on federal money laundering charges that allege he used Cyprus shell companies to purchase high-end residential and real estate in the United States. Also, this week's release of the Paradise Papers ties several of the world's elite and mega-rich to offshore shell companies registered in tax havens. This includes political advisors, political donors, and even current cabinet members such as U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, who even after joining the Trump cabinet in February 2017 is alleged to have kept a stake in the shipping company Navigator Holdings through a chain of companies in the Cayman Islands. One of the Navigator's biggest clients is a Russian gas and petrochemicals company called Cyber, which has close ties to the Kremlin. However, the release of the Paradise Papers and recent adjustments just reaffirm what we already knew about the perils of hidden beneficial ownership. These types of shell companies are also used by foreign governments and transnational criminal organizations to launder money throughout the U.S. financial system. The Iranian government used shell companies to hide its ownership of a Fifth Avenue skyscraper. The Las Zetas drug cartel used U.S. shell companies to launder dirty money through a horse farm in Oklahoma, and an Eastern European human trafficking ring used Kansas, Missouri, and Ohio shell companies to hide its illicit activities. Given the significant illicit finance risk these anonymous shell company structures entailed, what actions are you committed to taking to address these vulnerabilities?
So, of course, historically, I don't want to comment on any particular set of facts or circumstances, but historically and today, transparency in the international financial system and the AML CFT regime has always been a big priority for us. And we know that there are a number of legislative proposals in the Congress that are specifically addressing those types of issues, as you've done in the past, and we look forward to working with Congress on those proposals.
But in terms of what authority you have now addressing some of these issues, how do you do that? What do you do?
Well, we have a robust AML CFT regime, as you know, which, among other things, requires financial institutions to report suspicious activity to FinCEN. And there are a number of other requirements, of course, the banks are required to do when it comes to, again, enhancing and promoting the transparency of the financial system, as well as keeping illicit activity away from our financial system and internationally.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and we now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Undersecretary, it is known that Hezbollah uses a range of illicit activities around the globe, from corruption to money laundering. It has been U.S. policy to weaken Hezbollah because of its engagement in terrorism. Do you believe we are doing enough to ensure Hezbollah does not have the financial resources to engage in terrorism?
Well, thank you for that question. Hezbollah is a big area of focus for us. And this past February, we actually designated an IRGC Quds Force entity in connection and that had relationships with Hezbollah. We're very focused on it in our Iran strategy. We've been very focused on it in our multilateral engagements. We serve as the leader in a law enforcement, international law enforcement group that's specifically focused on Hezbollah. We believe that they present dangerous activities in their support for terrorism, and this is something that you will be hearing more from us in the near future.
Staying with Hezbollah for a minute, reports go back as far as 2004 showing their involvement in Latin America, specifically the tri-border region of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. What is the United States doing to curb Hezbollah's actions in this region?
Well, again, we work internationally with a number of partners to curb the activities of Hezbollah in connection with this law enforcement working group that we have. I raise our concerns with Hezbollah in many of my engagements multinationally, including in that region, including in the Gulf, and other partners in Europe, for example. So we have a lot of efforts underway in this regard. We work very closely with our interagency partners, also in countering and tracking the illicit financing that's going to support Lebanese Hezbollah, and we will continue to do so. It is without a doubt a big priority for this administration.
You know, I applaud OFAC's recent updating of its listing of IRGC entities to reflect their new terrorism designation, but there are public reports of hundreds of IRGC-owned or controlled entities that have not yet been named or sanctioned by Treasury. Can you tell me if we're looking at other entities?
We're always looking at entities, and again, in the last 10 months, in addition to designating the IRGC under 13224, we've also designated more than 70 individuals and entities in connection with the IRGC's efforts. It's a big area of focus for us. Again, it's something that I discuss with my partners overseas as well. I think that we need to take, that the world needs to take much more aggressive action to counter the malign behavior of the IRGC and the IRGC Quds Force, and we're very focused on doing so. We at the same time, we have to make sure that we're intelligence-driven. So what I am constantly focused on is making sure that we're going against targets where we can have the greatest strategic impact. And so just for example, in the last 4 months, we have, since I've been here, we have targeted entities and individuals in connection with their proliferation efforts, in connection with their ballistic missile development, and you will continue to see more of that coming from us.
Yeah, the remainder of my time, I want to talk about another issue that is not specifically called out in your written testimony, and I'm going to be doing a lot of follow-up with you on this issue. And it has to do with the epidemic of heroin in our country. And, you know, your offices have not been silent in this area. Back in September, OFAC designated 4 Mexican entities and 3 Mexican individuals linked to cartels, including Jalisco Nueva Generacion, as specially designated narcotics traffickers. 64,000 people we lost in 2016, 52,000 people in 2015. Of the people we lost in 2016, we're estimated that 15,000 are from heroin. Most, if not all, of the heroin we have in this country is coming from Mexico. If there was ever an issue that these two countries need to be working together on, it's smashing these cartels. And 130,000 people south of the border have been slaughtered by these cartels. And I'm not looking for any answers right now, but when I follow up with you in your office, I want to know if we have sufficient resources being put into this fight, maximum effort to track the money that's going to these entities that are killing people on both sides of our borders. And I would just encourage you, as you reach out to your Mexican counterparts, that we need to be working together on these issues.
If I can just quickly address, I share your concerns about the opioid epidemic, and as you may know, this has also been a big focus for the president, who recently made a big announcement with respect to our escalating our efforts against the opioid crisis. We do work closely with our Mexican counterparts on these narcotics trafficking regimes, and I'd be happy to come in and talk to you in some more detail about what some of the efforts that we've been undertaken. We've taken, I can tell you that we have an entire team that's very focused on using our authorities to designate narcotics traffickers. It's a big concern for us. I know it's a big concern for you, and I look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes. Chair now recognizes Mr. Himes for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being with us, and thank you for what you do. It's very important. Couple categories of questions. You used a word in your oral testimony and your written testimony that stuck in my ear a little bit. You said you are attacking North Korea. Attacking is a word I associate with a congressional declaration, other authorization, or with a presidential finding. I'm used to hearing the Department of Treasury talk about enforcing sanctions or looking for violations of law. So my question is, when you use the word attacking as you have, does that word mean something beyond, well, let me open-ended question. What exactly does that word mean beyond enforcing sanctions and looking for violations of domestic or international law?
We're doing a lot more than just enforcing sanctions. Of course, our sanctions regime is a very big part of our effort, and as I noted, we've sanctioned a number of individuals and entities in the last 10 months in connection with the North Korea problem. But there's a lot more that we have been doing. So just as an example, we recently designated a Chinese bank, Bank of Dandong, or designated, we issued a 311 action against a Chinese bank, the Bank of Dandong, which we finalized just last week. We've also been working with the private sector to make sure that they understand all of the evasive tactics that the North Koreans have traditionally used to get around our sanctions. So we issued a financial advisory last week, and I've been talking to banks all over the world about this problem because the North Koreans have been incredibly adept at evading our sanctions, and we need to take a much more holistic approach to cutting out those evasive tactics. So we've been targeting the front companies. We've been telling the banks how they can target the front companies. The banks have actually been giving us very useful information about illicit activity that they've been seeing. We've been working with our counterparts all over the world, in Europe, in South Korea, in Japan, in Australia, in the Gulf, to make sure that we're working in concert to implement the very tough UN Security Council resolutions that were just passed this August.
So let me just clarify. Thank you. Everything you're describing right now is the conventional language I'm used to hearing Treasury employ when they talk about these things, working with the private sector, designating, et cetera. So I guess my very specific question is, when you use the word attacking, are all of those activities consistent with authorities conferred by statute?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. My other set of questions was, I'm curious a little bit about the discussion in your testimony about the Saudi Terrorist Financing Targeting Center. Two questions, really. Can you tell us a little bit about what you anticipate the U.S. staffing at that center would be? That's question number one. by agency, if you can. I understand it hasn't actually opened yet. Is that correct?
It has opened. So we were just in the region 2 weeks ago, Secretary Mnuchin and I, and we had a little bit of a ribbon cutting ceremony. We have facilities that
Okay.
Saudi Arabia has provided.
So just,
to us.
I've only got about a minute and a half here, so I'm just curious about how the U.S. government is thinking about staffing that center, not just Treasury, but other agencies that may be involved. And secondarily, I'd love you to talk just a little bit about targeting. In other words, one of the challenges in the region, of course, is that some of the folks in the Gulf Cooperation Council have been known from time to actually help the terrorists. So I'm really curious about how you're thinking through the targeting function that that entity will undertake.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. So we have been deploying resources to the center. We've also made it clear that we're hoping for more appropriation to help us in the funding of the center. But our plan ultimately is to have upwards of 15 people from Treasury specifically dedicated to the center. Some of that is, of course, in the region, and then I have a number of people here in Washington, D.C. who are also actively working on supporting the efforts to make this an operational success, which it needs to be. In terms of targeting,
sorry, quick
yes.
question. Will there be other elements of the IC involved in that or present in that center?
Yes, so we've been working closely with interagency departments to make sure that we have the proper resources, not only from the Treasury Department, but also with other departments and agencies, as we do, frankly, in all of our efforts. All of our efforts are really interagency efforts. In terms of the targeting, I'll just give you one example, which I mentioned earlier, which is 2 weeks ago when we were in the Gulf, we announced joint designations by all of these countries against a number of targets in Yemen who have been involved in supporting ISIS and AQAP. And so part of our effort is going to be to make sure that we are continuing to jointly designate individuals and entities who are supporting terrorist financing. We have to work in very close partnership with our GCC colleagues to make that happen, because it's imperative that all of the GCC send the same very strong message that they will no longer tolerate the financing of terrorism in the region. And so this is a first but very important step in that effort.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Mandleker, thanks for being here. I'd like to be able to echo some of the comments that Mr. Rothfuss had stated in regards to the cartels as well. Just as an example, recently, Pueblo, Colorado, which happens to be the largest community in my district, it was uncovered by federal and local authorities, a drug cartel stronghold that was disguised as a legitimate business. It was an auto body repair shop. In that cartel activity, they found more than 60 pounds of heroin, 2.5 pounds of methamphetamines, 50 grams of cocaine, 35 firearms, $540,000 worth of cash. And it's truly unclear at this time whether or not this was being used to be able to launder money or resulting from its activity, or what the financial institution implications were as well. So on the first point, I guess we'd really like to be able to discuss with you and to be able to advocate in terms of paying attention to the cartels in Pueblo, visiting with the DEA. They've identified Russian cartels, Cuban cartels, Mexican cartels that are working in that area. But on a side note that we probably haven't covered here as well, and it's in the financial service sector, we've got a lot of small community banks as well. And you talked earlier in your testimony about the integration with all of the different components that you work with to be able to share the information, the identifying. What tools are you using to be able to help these small community banks perhaps uncover some of the money laundering activities or illicit use of funds and some of the exposure that they have, because simply by the nature of their size, they probably aren't going to have the resources? Sure.
So just to start with your first question, this is an area that I'm very familiar with, having prosecuted some of those cases when I was at the Department of Justice, and it is an area of focus for us. We work very closely with the DEA, actually, and they're a very important partner for us, both in the work that we do here in the U.S. and also internationally. And I would be happy to come down and sit and talk to you about the specific issues that you're facing in Colorado. In terms of the small community banks, I think that education and training is key. I know it's something that Treasury has done historically, and it's something that I'm going to make sure that we continue to do. We have been we will be also rapidly increasing the number of public-private dialogues that we have, and we're not just focused on the big banks in New York. We're going to be focused also in different regions in the country, in different types of banks. And I know and appreciate from my private sector experience that small community banks do need guidance and assistance, and we're committed to providing them with that guidance and assistance, both to make sure that they understand what their obligations are, and also so that we understand that what they do is going to look a little bit different than some of the banks that have a lot more resources.
Has it been your experience at all through those different elements that you've already worked in that our smaller community banks would be less likely, more likely to be able to identify some illicit activity?
So I'd like to come back to you and give you a better assessment on that particular question. Look, the bigger banks, of course, are going to have a lot more resources to implement the kind of AML regimes that they've been implementing. But we need to make sure that the small community banks understand, again, what their obligations are, but also so that they get the right kind of training to be able to detect this illicit finance. What we don't want to have happen is for illicit actors to suddenly think that they can go to the small community banks and take advantage of them. That's also very important to us. But I very much appreciate that the small community banks are different in size from the bigger banks, and we have to make sure we have a very good and concerted effort to get them an understanding of what their obligations are. So again, they can join us as they have in this effort to keep illicit actors from abusing their system.
Great, I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, my next question would be a little bit lengthy, and I'd like to maybe be able to submit that to the record, and we can have maybe that conversation in our office. And appreciate your forthrightness and look forward to our visit.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Kiwan. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you for being here today. As you know, I represent the district in Las Vegas, Nevada, and just not long ago, there was a shooting that killed 58 people and injured over 500. It's been reported in the news that in the last 3 years alone, more than 200 suspicious activity reports about the Las Vegas shooters' activities, particularly large transactions at casinos, have been filed with the law enforcement authorities. When an individual has such a tremendous amount of CTRs and SARs filed on their activities, does it trigger a law enforcement investigation? And what does that investigation look like?
So thank you for that question, and of course I wouldn't be able to talk about any particular set of SARs or circumstances. We'd be happy to come and talk to you about it personally. Look, there are various tools analytic tools, not only that we have, but other members of law enforcement has when it comes to understanding what's coming in through our system in terms of the SARs. We deploy those tools. We have, again, an overlay of analytic tools that we use to make sure that we're detecting suspicious activity, and we are very dedicated not only to making sure that we continue to do so, but to making sure that we elevate our technological capacity.
Thank you, Madam Undersecretary. And more broadly, can you comment on the type of analysis that FinCEN does on an ongoing basis of the SARs and that it receives from covered institutions? And also, to what extent is FinCEN actively sifting through this data to identify actors whose suspicious activities warrant scrutiny by law enforcement?
So again, we do a lot of analysis when it comes to looking at the types of information that's coming in through those SARs. It's not only us, of course. There are many different law enforcement agencies that have access to the BSA system as well they should. So we work in close partnership. When we see trends, we work in close partnership with our law enforcement partners. We also put out a number of financial advisories, similarly when it comes to seeing trends in illicit activities, because we think it's very important that the financial institutions also understand what we are seeing and incorporate different kinds of typologies in their algorithms, because what we want them to do is to have the sophisticated means to red alert particular illicit activity that's problematic. So we do a lot of work analyzing the data. I know our law enforcement partners likewise do a lot of work analyzing the data. We have very good and constructive dialogues with them, and we also have important dialogues with the private sector.
Thank you. And my last question, I've heard from the casinos that they're having to file the CTRs and SARs in large numbers for what in the gaming world is relatively routine operation. The American Gaming Association estimates that the industry filed 58,000 SARs and more than 1 million CTRs last year. Taking both the regulatory burden and law enforcement objectives into consideration, what are your views on changing the reporting thresholds?
So I know that's a subject that there's also a lot of discussion in the Congress, and how do we think through what changes we might make to the BSA regime. That's something that we're taking a hard look at. We're reviewing it very carefully. I don't want to comment on the particular problem of the American Gaming Association, but we need to make sure that we're getting the right data that we need from the financial institutions, and they are focused on the high value threats. And so I look forward really to working closely with this Congress on that issue. I think that we need to make sure that we're making decisions based on data, so we're digging into the data and digging into the details, so that, again, we have a system in place that gives us the information that we need, and that focuses the private sector on providing us with what is all of our objective, which is to protect the integrity of the financial system.
Thank you, Madam Undersecretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Madam Secretary, thank you for taking time to meet with us today. I appreciate that and discuss these important programs. Our nation's security is paramount, and the work that you and the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence do is extremely important in keeping us safe. It's all of our goals to keep those who wish to harm us from having the financial means to do so. I look forward to hearing how the Trump administration, your team, are prepared to tackle the challenges before us as we move on. So, question is, Madam Secretary, earlier this morning during a hearing before the Subcommittee on Monetary Policy and Trade, I had the pleasure of hearing testimony from one of your colleagues, Undersecretary Malpass, regarding the IMF. And in his testimony, Mr. Malpass discusses the technical assistance provided by the IMF to nations in need. A small part of that assistance targets improving countries' ability to combat money laundering and terrorism financing. So to what extent does your team interact with foreign nations and the IMF when developing effective anti-terrorism strategies? Or to be more specific, are we ensuring that we are incorporating a broad spectrum of international terrorist financing when developing those strategies?
Absolutely, that's a very big focus for us. We work both in tandem with the IMF, and we're also leaders in the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF. We currently have the vice presidency of the FATF, and next summer we will have the presidency of the FATF, which is really an international body that is very focused on making sure that countries around the world have the regulatory regimes in place that we all want them to have when it comes to AML and CFT. So not only are we very involved in setting those standards and making sure they're up to par in the way that we would want them to be, but we also play a very active role in assessing the regimes in other countries called mutual evaluations or assessments. So it's something that we're very focused on. It's something that I raise regularly in my interactions with my counterparts all over the world. Look, we do have a very strong AML regime, but we need to make sure that our allies and partners all over the world have the same regime, and it's a concerted effort on our part.
Okay. In your testimony, you touch on the need for BSA reform and say that your team is currently taking a hard look at the current framework, that this is a welcome action. This subcommittee has had institutions testify to the sentiment that cost of compliance with this law is difficult and expensive. So what is the status of your review, and what changes would you like to see made to the BSA that would ensure that improvements are made to improve anti-money laundering efforts at these institutions?
So as I mentioned, we're taking a hard look at the BSA. We want to make sure that we have a regime in place that's harnessing the resources of the banks in the right way. So, you know, the financial institutions have thousands of financial crime analysts, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. And we need to make sure that those resources are deployed, and they're really in some ways on the front lines for what we're trying to accomplish and do. We need to make sure those resources are deployed, again, to give us the information that we need on a number of different threats, but with a real focus on our high priority threats. And so that's what we're taking a careful look at. How do we have a system in place that's going to ensure that we're targeting the resources in the right way, so that, and we've had discussions with the financial institutions. I've had discussions with the banks about that, and I have a sense of where they're deploying their resources and how they're deploying their resources, and I want to make sure that they're focused to achieve what we all want to achieve, which is to safeguard the financial system and to make sure that we have the right level of transparency in that system.
Okay, I yield my time back. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Undersecretary, for being here today. Arizonans are deeply concerned about the increasingly unstable regime in North Korea and the threat it poses to regional stability and our national security. So Congress has passed multiple rounds of sanctions to hold North Korea and other bad actors accountable, but the threat of weapons proliferation exists and persists. While sanctions are an essential tool to discourage proliferation, they're not a complete solution to the threats we face. So my first question for you is, along with sanctions, some advocates have suggested a risk-based approach by our global financial institutions to actively identify and cut off financing within their own institutions used for weapons proliferation. And my question for you is, what is Treasury's view of the efficacy of this approach?
Look, we work globally with other countries on this problem and with the financial institutions on this particular problem. So what we've been focused on a variety of fronts with respect to this problem, because it's not just sanctions alone, and we don't think it's sanctions alone. So among other things, we've been providing typologies to banks all over the world with respect to enhance their capacity to detect illicit evasion schemes, to detect the front companies that North Korea has been so adept at using to facilitate this kind of financing. We also work with the Financial Action Task Force, which I mentioned recently, which is an international body that's focused on making sure that we have the right standards across the world when it comes to AML and CFT. And this body actually just met the last week or so and issued served as the leaders in this effort with other counterparts for them to issue a statement that's very specifically focused on the North Korea proliferation financing. We're also working with the G7 on actions that we can take jointly to counter financing. So there are many other things that we're doing. That's just a list of a few, but we're working with high-risk jurisdictions. We're working with partners and key allies. This has to be a global effort. The UN Security Council resolutions that were passed in August and September made that clear that it has to be a global effort, and we're very actively involved in implementing that regime. And I'll just end with another area of focus for us is going after North Korean financial facilitators. So there are people who North Korea has deployed all over the world to help They're very skilled. They have a particular skill set and expertise to help to provide illicit financing back to the regime. So in last month, we actually designated 26 of these financial facilitators. We've designated others in the past, and that's another area where we're very focused on, and they are in some high-risk jurisdictions. So it's something that I agree with you. It's something we're focused on. It's a big part of our effort, in addition to the sanctions that we've been deploying.
Thank you. You know, more sophisticated proliferators will use front companies or proxies to circumvent safeguards that are put in place by major financial institutions. So what, if any, best practices has Treasury offered to financial institutions in these high-risk jurisdictions to take this risk-based approach to stop money laundering or kind of suspicious transactions and other activities that are seeking to conceal proliferation finance?
So as I mentioned, we've been sharing this kind of information with the banks. So last week we issued a 10-page financial advisory that alerted the banks to the kinds of front company activity that North Korea, again, has been very adept. I was recently in Europe where, in addition to meeting with my government counterparts, I met with banks in 3 different cities, again, to alert them to the typologies that we are seeing when it comes to North Korea front company activity. And we've been doing that across the board in many of our engagements.
Thank you. And my last question would be, has Treasury considered the role that entities such as FinCEN and prudential regulators play in this regard, and how can they be more actively engaged? So
FinCEN, of course, is one of the agencies that I supervise, and what I've been discussing is activity that FinCEN has been very involved in and will continue to be.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'm also submitting a number of questions for the record concerning Iran and its nuclear program, but thank you for the time. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin, for 5 minutes for questions.
Over here, Madam Undersecretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much, and thank you, Madam Undersecretary, for being here. We appreciate very much all the hard work you're doing and your terrific staff to make sure that the folks who want to cause American family harm do not receive the funding they need to carry out their business. Madam Undersecretary, you've been in this business for quite some time. Now, I know it's been a short period of time in your current position. Could you comment on how is this business of stopping illicit financing for terrorist activities changed over the last 10 or 20 years?
So I think we've had a much more concerted effort. So of course,
by whom?
Well, I would say by the Treasury Department, by law enforcement.
Hey, did you find that this activity was so concentrated the last administration, or the one before that, or has it ramped up recently?
I would say there's been a ramp up since 2004 when TFI was created. So I think there was a recognition, as I mentioned, in the post 9/11 world that it was important to put these 4 components together to deploy this broad range of economic authorities that we have in concert with one another.
And how about foreign governments, Madam Undersecretary? How have they responded recently as compared to 5 or 10 years ago with respect to your activity and those that came before you as far as stopping these illicit funds from reaching home?
So what I can really comment on is what I've seen in the 4 months that I've been here, and I also have some experience historically. But we've seen we've benefited from a partnership with a great many countries.
Is that getting better or worse?
I would like to say it's getting better because we're having a very important dialogue with them, but this has been a concerted effort for some time. We also have been very focused on capacity building. So we want to make sure that other countries have the regimes in place to enforce sanctions in the way that we enforce those sanctions.
With American and coalition victories over ISIS in Syria and Iraq in particular recently, have you folks discovered anything new about the strategies involved in illicitly financing terrorist activities? Are they becoming less institutionalized, more decentralized? What have you learned?
So I would defer to perhaps a briefing in another setting before getting into some of those details. What I think we are seeing is a lot of success in our efforts, of course, to counter counter ISIS, including in financing, and it's something that we've been focused on. Also, we focus on it in very close collaboration, not only with our interagency partners, because that's important, but also we lead a counter ISIS global coalition focused on terrorist financing.
A short time ago, you and I met with a smaller group of members of this committee dealing with this issue. And of course, I know you won't disclose anything that is classified, but I was very interested, and I think other folks would be also, about some of the specific ways that the North Korean government is getting hard currency back to its homeland. And you just mentioned a moment ago financial facilitators. Could you explain that a little bit more? And we don't have much time.
So financial facilitators are individuals who have a particular expertise and skill set.
So they're folks that are from North Korea that leave their homeland to go work in other places, and they send their hard cash back home. Is that correct?
Through various sophisticated means.
Legal or illegal means?
Well, we believe it's illicit.
Fine, thank you. And we're making headway as far as choking off that form of financing for the North Korean goal that they're now.
Yes.
The path that they're on.
Yes,
okay, let me pivot in my last question, if I may, Madam Undersecretary. We just had a horrific attack on our homeland a very short time ago in New York City, where an individual got a hold of a rental truck and drove it down a bike path on the west side of Manhattan for about 40 blocks, about 2 miles roughly. How does someone like that tap into this network of illicit financing? Is it institutionalized? Is it specific to that individual? Do you have any idea where that originates and how we can stop that?
So I don't want to comment on that specific case.
I understand.
It's obviously an active law enforcement investigation, but we of course do work to identify how those kinds of individuals who appear to be lone wolf, for example, get their financing. It is an area.
Can you give the American people any confidence that we're making headway at Treasury to stop this?
I think we're making headway at Treasury across a wide array of efforts.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Undersecretary. Keep doing your great work. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair would now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes for questions.
Welcome, Madam Secretary, Undersecretary. When the Panama Papers came out, people were commenting that Americans were largely missing from that report. And some law enforcement friends pointed out to me that Americans don't have to go to Panama to hide their money. They can hide it in the United States very easily in these LLCs. And actually, at the request of law enforcement that was tracking terrorism financing, drug financing, and they'd hit a brick wall called an LLC, I introduced a bill roughly 15 years ago called the Corporate Transparency Act, which would crack down on anonymous shell companies by requiring companies to disclose their true beneficial owners at the time that the companies formed. Would having access in Treasury to beneficial ownership information be helpful to your office in cracking down on money laundering and terrorism financing?
So thank you for that question. I know this is something that has been of long concern to you. What I can tell you is that there are a number of bills I know that have been introduced in Congress in this particular area. This is a complex issue and a complex problem. Transparency, of course, is very important for us. I know that from not only my 4 months in Treasury, but also my time as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice and in the private sector. And so, and as I'm sure you know, last year we issued the CDD rule, which requires financial institutions to get beneficial ownership information from their customers, which I think is going to be a very important effort and advancement in this regard. So I look forward to working with you and others on what is the right model, what makes sense in terms of increasing transparency in our system.
My bill would require FinCEN to build a database of beneficial ownership information which would be accessible to law enforcement and to financial institutions for purposes of their own know your customer obligations. Does FinCEN have the capacity to build this database? Or would you need additional funding to build the database? Would you build it through Treasury or the private sector or FinCEN? Have you put any thought into it? Because the chairman tells me that we may be moving, thankfully, a beneficial ownership bill.
So again, this is a complex issue and a complex problem, and I'd be happy to come back and talk to you about what we think makes sense in this regard, without commenting on at this time on any particular piece of legislation.
Well, then why don't I send you the legislation and a list of questions, and I'd like to ask you about the effectiveness of Know Your Customer. Banks are cracking down. We may be cracking down on LLCs. Then all of a sudden you have in crypto and Bitcoin, which has no regulation at all. No one knows the value. If you go on the web, you'll see some are $26, others are $6,000. It jumps to $7,000, $8,000. There's no explanation of why it's jumping, or there's just absolutely no control on it. What steps is Treasury having to really try to protect consumers and investors in this new currency?
We are very concerned with this new currency. I think actually we're the leaders in the world when it comes to regulating cryptocurrency, and so in addition to the regulations that we have, which requires exchangers to have an AML program, we're also focusing our enforcement actions on going after cryptocurrency that harvests this type of illicit behavior. So just, I think it was 2 months ago, as I mentioned, we brought a case in close coordination with the Department of Justice against a cryptocurrency scheme that was housed internationally. And so in that effort, we're sending a very strong message around the world that we're on the lookout for the use of these cryptocurrencies to engage in illicit activity. We're also working with counterparts around the world to make sure that they have the regulatory regimes that they need to have in place to monitor and effectively have AML mechanisms to monitor this type of behavior, because it can't be the United States engaging in this alone. It has to be an international effort.
Mm-hmm. Well, my time has expired. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair would now recognize the gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Love, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Undersecretary, for being here today. I have done a little bit of work on human and sex trafficking, and I'm realizing that we're dealing with a group or an organization that's a lot bigger than what we think. I met a young girl who was working at the age of 13 in Mexico and was pretty much targeted. The young man was talking to her for about 3 weeks. And after he had convinced her and had found out about her, knew that she was vulnerable at home, brought her in to the family, and took the time, actually, to go in. Then inadvertently, after a while, got across the border, worked in Manhattan, realized that the uncle was actually the pimp, cousins everywhere. I mean, you're talking about drivers, the drivers and appointments that they would go to, and she was locked in this room, and she was trafficked for over 3 years. Listening to her story and listening to the amount of people that were involved and how much time and effort they took, they had it down to a science. And I'm looking at your bio and the objectives of the agency which you oversee, and it's clear you have some expertise combating a host of illicit activities. My understanding is that many of these, such are narcotics trafficking, money laundering, some of those may overlap with human trafficking. Do you or the agency that you oversee encounter this horrible crime within those activities? And if so, can the Treasury do anything to prevent inadvertently financing for human trafficking?
So I share your grave concern about human trafficking. It's actually an area that was a big focus of mine when I was at the Justice Department. So in my last 2.5 years in the Justice Department, I supervised several number of sections, including the child exploitation and obscenity section, where we had a very big focus on child trafficking. It's not. And of course, it's not just a trafficking problem. We also have a problem with child prostitution here, domestic prostitution here in the United States, which is part of what you discussed with this poor child in New York. So it's something that I'm very familiar with, and something that I've dedicated a lot of effort to in the past. What we've been doing at the Treasury Department is working very closely with our partners overseas to make sure that we collaborate when it comes to information that we get either through our SARS or that they receive through their AML regimes on suspicious activity very focused on trafficking. So we lead an effort in that regard. We're also considering other ways.
Okay. So as you consider other ways, I know Section 314B of Patriot grants financial institutions with the ability to share information one with another to prevent money laundering and terrorist activities. Over the course of this year, my office and I have met with numerous 501c3s and organizations that are working to combat human trafficking, and they have a great deal of information about traffickers, how these traffickers operate, especially in some other countries, and how they're actually connected to the United States. I've actually witnessed a lot of the aftercares that I've seen that may have been inadvertently funded that are used as actual shells for, or I could say the mechanism for actually selling of these children. Do you think it would be feasible and effective to add these kinds of organizations to the list of organizations that would be eligible to participate in 314B?
So what I can tell you as a general matter, I think the NGOs provide an incredible amount of extremely valuable information when it comes to trafficking, and I worked at the Justice Department. We worked closely with the NGOs in a wide range of child exploitation issues. I'd be happy to talk to you about any particular provision. I mean, 314B right now is really focused on the financial institutions. There may be other mechanisms when it comes to information sharing. I know that there is a lot of information sharing that goes on already. The question as to whether that safe harbor is the right provision with respect to deal with this particular problem is something we'd be happy to take a look at.
I would love to talk to you about it because there's so much information that is not being shared between the 501c3s that have done a lot of work and your department that I think would be really beneficial to at least even following where the money is. And anyway, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Thank Undersecretary for being with us today. Congratulations in your new position. This is a topic I want to raise with deference to my colleagues on my favorite subject, but since you're new in your position and we've switched administration, I want to talk about this continued topic of beneficial ownership and how we assess it. And you know, when you look at the rule that you have pending that will come into effect for banks in 2018, there's a lot of varying ability to comply with that rule across the financial services space, from the very big sophisticated partners that you deal with that do 80% of the global transactions down to community banks. And one issue I keep raising is the IRS already has the data that you want, because if you have a pass-through entity, a subchapter S, an LLC, they file a partnership return, a pass-through federal tax form with the IRS, and at least once a year that shows the beneficial ownership, because you have to issue a K-1 to everybody who's a pass-through owner recipient under that pass-through entity. And it's a challenging area, but to me, to spend legal time sorting through that and finding a way to use that data would be far better for the federal government and for the private sector than dealing with the 50 state incorporation standards across our country, which we can't really do anything about very effectively in a very timely way. So I raise this issue for you and ask for your view on getting the very sharpest minds in your legal office and at Maine Treasury to try to figure out a way to, consistent with privacy, obtain that data for the purposes of determining beneficial ownership.
Look, as you know, this is a complex issue, and I know that there are a lot of different options that are on the table. We are studying those options. There's balancing that needs to take place, and I look forward to working with you on it. I'm not going to comment at this point on any particular solution, but it's certainly something that we are studying very closely.
Switching back to your enforcement of sanctions, your sanctions on in regard to the North Korea situation. I know you were asked questions, is it better than it has been in the past? And just in the 4 months you've been involved in the process, are you seeing leads and enforcement from our allied nations, both in North Asia and around the world? You see a distinct cooperation, is the question I'm asking, for enforcement now of both the UN sanctions and the sanctions that the United States has put on?
We are seeing cooperation. We're tracking it very carefully and closely. We do that. The State Department does that. We now have the strongest UN Security Council resolutions that we've ever had, but they can't be resolutions on paper. They have to be monitored and implemented and enforced. And so we work very closely with our allies and partners on this problem. We also work to monitor what other countries are doing, and of course to the extent that we need to pressure them to do more. So yes, we're seeing more than I believe that we're seeing more than we have before, and of course we are very intent on staying on top of it.
Well, you've got strong bipartisan support for both our bilateral sanctions and for the good work Ambassador Haley has done at the United Nations. But this issue of enforcement by both small and large companies, North Asian and countries and North Asian players is important, and I hope you'll keep the members of this committee attuned, either in a classified or unclassified briefing, as to who is not doing a good job under multilateral or bilateral sanctions, so that when we are with the representatives of those countries, we can call them out, because this is an important phase. I don't think the U.S. over the past 24 years has ever had a coordinated, effective sanctions regime on North Korea. Now we're in our 4th administration. So this is a chance for us in the United States, I think, to get this right. And to get it right, we're going to have effective enforcement. So thanks for what you're doing. Appreciate that, and I hope you'll commit to keep us informed on who we need to call out on not doing an effective job.
I would be happy to do that. I can tell you that in my conversations with some of my counterparts, I also emphasize that our Congress is very intent on making sure that we're doing the right thing and applying maximum economic pressure. So happy to sit down and talk to you about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Undersecretary. Always amazed by your expertise in this subject, and so thanks for your service to our country and for the great men and women that you lead in this role. So we really appreciate them and the importance that the function serves for keeping our country safe. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Rothfuss and Ms. Love on drug cartels for one and human trafficking for the other. These are things that are present threats in our country, and our office will be working particularly with Mr. Rothfuss on drug trafficking, as Ohio has a tremendous problem with overdose deaths. And I'm just curious if you could put into scope the size of dollar volume and number of transactions that you suspect are associated with drug trafficking on the one hand and human trafficking on the other.
So for those numbers, I would really defer to my colleagues at the DEA, the Justice Department, the State Department. I know, these are tracked very carefully, but I want to make sure that we get it right. So we'd be happy to provide you with some additional information. I can tell you that the drug trafficking problem in particular is something that we're very focused on. We have a team that's been working on this intently for a number of years, and they're not just here in the United States. We also have them deployed into some key countries. It's a very active portfolio for us, and this crisis is one that hits all of us. It's not just an international problem. I know it hits you at home, so it's something we're focused on. We're going to continue to be.
Yeah, an impressive set of capabilities, and some that are expanded. You know, as you mentioned, since 9/11, we've changed some laws. We've added a lot of flexibility, and I'm just curious if you could provide a distinction in the support you provide for law enforcement between the term query and search.
I'm not sure I understand your.
I guess you know, the distinction between law enforcement asking you to query a database versus asking for support on a search warrant.
Oh, I see. So law enforcement has this access to the BSA database just as we do. So they don't actually need to come to us to get that type of information. We have MOUs with a number of different law enforcement agencies. Of course, when they need our help, we're happy to provide it to them. We work very closely with a number of different law enforcement agencies on a wide array of efforts. But they don't need to come to us. They've got the same access that we do.
Direct access, okay. And so as you update the things that you're asking for support from our financial institutions, you know, your business rules, I think they're termed, how do you update those, and if you have flags because of recent activity, whether that's truck rentals, cross-border activity, how do you update those, and how timely can that be? Because you know, banks have whole floors devoted to this compliance of AML and BSA. How do they get focused and productive?
So we work closely with the banks. I mean, one of the things that we've done historically, but we're going to be increasing, are public-private dialogues with the banks. That's where we go to the banks and we tell them, look, we have a particular case or a particular typology. We present that information to them and ask for their feedback. So and then of course there are a lot of different ways in which we update our rules or our queries to detect different types of activities, and as do our partners in the law enforcement community.
Okay, so one of the ways that you interact is through 314A, but then, you know, we've seen some interest in expanding the ways for banks to interact with one another, financial institutions to interact with one another. It's really, you know, somewhat intuitive to understand how a law enforcement organization would be working with banks to access information in their databases, the know your customer regimes, things like this, suspicious activity reports. It's not intuitive to me, anyway, as to why they would need to engage in ostensibly law enforcement functions amongst themselves with no government involvement whatsoever. Well, could you elaborate on that, please?
We do. Look, we're encouraged that banks are working with each other in different settings, and we do interact closely with them in those efforts. So, for example, there's a consortium of banks under 314A that are sharing information with each other and providing us with the link analysis that they're getting and identifying illicit activity and front companies. I think that when they do that, they are also enhancing their own ability to sophisticate their algorithms and their red alerts. So it's been something that has been beneficial to us. I think it's also been beneficial to them.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Undersecretary, for all that you do in service to our nation. And again, I also agree that your expertise is quite amazing across so many different areas. So thank you again for serving our country in the way that you do. So this past July, my colleague from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, and I introduced National Strategy for Combating Terrorist, Underground, and Other Illicit Financing Act. And in August, our legislation was rolled into a sanctions bill, the Russia, Iran, North Korea sanctions package, and signed into law. So the Budd-Sinema legislation requires that the President consult with Treasury and other appropriate agencies to develop a national strategy for combating the financing of terrorism. So are you aware of any planning sessions that have begun as a result of that? And can you elaborate on them?
Yes, absolutely. So we're leading that effort in the strategy. We're working closely with our law enforcement interagency partners. It's actually something I'm familiar with because it is an effort. We had these kinds of strategies when I was at the Justice Department and also at Homeland Security, 10 or so years ago. So we are actively working on the strategy, and we'll be happy to update you on it.
Glad to. Thank you. So outside of that legislation, what are the role, in your view, should Congress be playing in the fight against terrorist financing in the U.S. or abroad?
Well, I think Congress has provided us with tremendous authorities and tools to combat terrorism, illicit financing. I know it's been an area that's been of great concern to this committee, and we very much appreciate your partnership in that. I will say one area that I think would also be helpful for us is the ability to ensure that we can stay flexible in the use of our authorities. So we've seen there have been some pieces of legislation which have tried to limit our licensing authorities, for example, or our ability to waive or delist entities. And what I'm constantly focused on is making sure that we are using our economic authorities aggressively to combat terrorist financing, proliferation, human rights violators, et cetera, and the ability to do so and to achieve what we all collectively want, which is really maximum strategic impact to curb these threats, also requires that we act with agility and flexibility. So I'd be happy to talk to the committee about that some more, but I would also ask that you make sure that we have the flexibility that we need to execute our authorities in the way that I know you would all want us to do.
Let's continue the dialogue on that so you can have that flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with the time I have left, I want to transition into the fintech and the virtual currency space, and I want to get your opinion on Treasury's role in that arena. So I think we as lawmakers are in a tough spot right now. So how do we encourage fintech to innovate by limiting regulation, but at the same time getting ahead of what many in the national security field see as a future problem? So, and that's increased terror and illicit use of virtual and cryptocurrencies. Any thoughts there?
So it's an area that we're focused on. We're actually going to be, folks in my staff are going to be, and I will as well, doing some work having productive dialogues with FinTech and RegTech. Look, I think this is the wave of the future. Artificial intelligence is the wave of the future. We need to make sure that we stay on top of it. That, among others, the financial institutions can continue to sophisticate the ways in which they track illicit financing, and that we in the Treasury and in the government do the same. So again, something I'd be happy to discuss with you in the future. We have to be ahead of these illicit actors, far, far ahead of these illicit actors, and some of that, of course, is going to involve FinTech and some of the exciting new developments that are in the arena.
Any changes in particular that you see are concerning in the virtual currency landscape that's appropriate for this conversation?
I wouldn't say it's appropriate for this conversation.
Sure. Okay. Well, in your view, is there any way that we can more effectively balance the anti-money laundering, combating financial terrorism, the interest of the government there, with encouraging innovation?
Look, I'm a big proponent of encouraging innovation. We're seeing a lot of innovation. I've been seeing a lot of it, frankly, in the last 4 months. I think it's something we need to encourage innovation. There are a lot of different ways to do so. And again, I'd be happy to have a longer conversation with you about it. I know also that there are a number of different pieces of legislation that are focused on and recommendations from the private sector that are focused on making sure that they can innovate in the way that they need to, and it's something that I'm very involved in exploring.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you again.
Gentleman's time has expired. Memphis is the home of the Memphis Belle. Elvis Presley, King Cotton, and our next questioner. I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Undersecretary, for being here today. And as a former United States Attorney, thank you for your prior service to the Department of Justice as well. If I could, back in June, Representative Sinema and I wrote a joint letter to Treasury urging the Financial Action Task Force to reimpose countermeasures against Iran. I think we've all seen that Iran has continued to engage in troubling behavior throughout the Middle East, which poses a continued and serious threat and a growing threat. And if I could, I did receive a letter back in July of this year from Deputy Assistant Secretary Matt Kellogg. I won't read all of it to you, but if I could cite part of the letter and then ask you, he says that the FATF decided in June to maintain Iran on its quote-unquote blacklist, close quote, and called upon its members and urged all jurisdictions to continue advising their financial institutions to apply enhanced due diligence to business relationships and transactions with all natural and legal persons from Iran. He then goes on to say that we will also continue to address Iran's troubling behavior throughout the Middle East, which poses a serious and growing threat. And I do appreciate the response that I received back from Treasury. Can you elaborate, if you could, on any further sanctions or any further actions that Treasury and other entities are taking against Iran at this time?
I'd be happy to. So Iran is a big area of focus for us in the Treasury Department. As you may know, the President recently announced a new strategy to counter Iran's malign and destabilizing activity, and at the Treasury Department, we're a very big part of that effort. So we've issued over 70 designations in the past, since the beginning of this administration, against entities that have been involved in Iran's ballistic missile development and Iran's support for terrorism, in its human rights violations and proliferation, and we're not gonna stop. I mean, we have to be. I think really the world has to be united in its efforts to counter the malign and destabilizing activity of the Iranian regime, and we are intent on doing so. We're also working within the FATF or the FATF on monitoring any developments with respect to Iran's AML and CFT regime. Look, there is no transparency in the Iranian system, in the Iranian economy. Not only that, but the IRGC plays a very big role in the Iranian economy, and there needs to be significant changes on both fronts, and we are intent on holding them accountable in that regard.
In the July letter back to me, he cites that the FATF has again decided not to lift countermeasures, extending a temporary suspension of countermeasures instead. That is still in place?
That is currently still in place. The review process for Iran will end in February, and it's, again, something that we are working on very intently.
And after February, can you give any assurances that it will be extended, or what do you see happening after February 2018? Well,
the FATF is a consensus body, so I can't tell you exactly what the FATF will do. What I can tell you is that this is a very big effort, focus of effort for us in the United States. We are deeply disappointed by what Iran has been doing with respect to their FATF, the FATF efforts. And we've made our expectations known, and we've made our disappointment known, and will continue to do so, including in February.
And I appreciate that. If I can, to follow up on a question, and maybe Mr. Budd's question as well, about the cryptocurrencies, and I think one concern that we all have is that some lone wolf, if you will, or some small cell terrorist will try to use the virtual or cryptocurrencies for activity. Would you, if you could, describe the extent that any attackers have relied on anonymous financing means such as cryptocurrency?
So I don't think that I can do so in this setting. What I can tell you is that cryptocurrency is a big area of focus for us, and I know it is for the Department of Justice as well. It was when I was at the Department of Justice, and we're going to continue to take action in connection with the use of by any illicit actor of cryptocurrency.
If Thank you very much. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. I would now like to call the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Ed Royce.
Well, thank you, Secretary. Congratulations again to you.
Thank you.
We've had a chance to talk about a couple of things. I wanted to follow up on Ed Perlmutter's commentary to you earlier, and I share the same concern here. We've been working on sanctions issues now, and our concern is that you inherited basically an agency that is the linchpin of the enforcement, and the budget is going to be inadequate to the dramatic increase in sanctions that we're passing. We've passed, over the last 20 years, I've been engaged in most of these issues, and all of a sudden you've got an exponential increase. And the other part of this that I'm concerned about is workforce retention, not because of the culture in the agency. The problem is that the private sector has a demand for the skill that you're turning out. And so the reality is you're also going to be losing people to the private sector that are willing to pay to get that kind of expertise. And suddenly the amount of expertise necessary to deal with what we've done on Korea and what we're doing on Iranian missile sanctions and so forth, that is going to be a challenge. You're going to have a situation where you're able to retain skilled staff, and we're going to have to be agile at replacing individuals that do get hired away. And for all of those reasons, the point Ed raised and that I'm raising with you sort of demands a strategy in terms of how you address that.
So I've been very focused on that issue as well. Look, I think I've been incredibly impressed since I've heard this before I came to Treasury, but it's really true, by the mission focus of the people who work in the Treasury Department, and in particular on this portfolio. So you have we have a number of people, in fact, I would say the whole workforce, who comes to work every day inspired and excited about the work that they do, because they're helping to protect the safety and security of our country. At the same time, retention is important. Recruitment is also very important. We have to recruit the best and the brightest. And I have a number of initiatives. I'd be happy to come talk to you about.
Well, Hezbollah sanctions are coming as well. So I wanted to offer a dialogue with you and your staff on this critical issue if we could, because I think it's going to, normally you would consider it sort of overwhelming in terms of the amount of workload that's coming. And that's just not just my concern. My team that helped me write the sanctions bills, we're all concerned about.
Thank you.
About that. I do have a few questions related to anti-money laundering efforts, and I've talked to you before about my concern about the Know Your Customer law, and yet we don't have transparency, and that issue has come up a couple of times today in terms of different ways to deal with that. But the threshold for filing suspicious activity reports was set back in 1996, and the threshold for filing currency transaction reports, that was in 1972. So how were the threshold amounts determined 20 years ago and 45 years ago? And do you think it's time for Congress and Treasury to revisit the thresholds?
I think it's time for us to revisit the regime writ large. I mean, we have to get out of the 1970s and the 1990s and move way past 2017. So I look forward to working with you on that. I think it's a very important effort. You know, I view the financial crimes analysts who are working on these SARs and other reporting mechanisms as really being on the front lines for us.
But I think we have to do it in tandem with the beneficial ownership issue. We've got to get transparency in our system. We're not as bad as Kenya, but we're the second worst from the bottom in terms of being able to monitor this, and it has to be addressed. And we'll talk more about that. How do we encourage the use of new technologies to combat money laundering, and do financial institutions have sufficient legal certainty to be innovative in their efforts? And would you be supportive of further clarification along these lines?
Look, I think innovation is very important. I've had financial institutions come and talk to me about the efforts that they're undertaking to be more innovative, and I think that we need to encourage and promote that activity. So whether we need guidance or different statutory authorities, it's something that we'd have to discuss, but they need to be more sophisticated. They need to have more sophisticated algorithms, and of course there's a lot of discussion about the use of AI in helping to monitor and detect illicit financing, and we need to stay ahead of it. The criminals are ahead of it. We need to be far ahead of them.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. Would like to thank you, Secretary Mandelker, for being with us today and for your testimony. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witness to please respond as promptly as they are able. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.